how a single dagger throw ended a campaign. This is the story of how my first few minutes in a campaign set in motion a chain of events that compelled a player to tear the game apart. We'll call that player Tiamat for the duration of this tale. For your edification, she made it known that she and DM had been friends for years. In the first session, Tiamat was taking up a lot of time role-playing with an NPC. So Lumen, my dwarf, Tabaxi rogue, got cute and threw a dagger at the wall near her. It was a simple theatric meant to establish his devil-may-care attitude and pull the rest of the party into the fold. Tiamat took this gesture with as much grace as a rock performing ballet. She confronted Lumen and spoke down to him repeatedly, even after receiving a sincere apology. This smug persona was one she seemed completely unwilling to drop, and it grated against every player she spoke with. Lumen was simply the only one who was directly vocal about it. He pointed out how her attachment to her ego was making it difficult to speak with her, after which she wasted 15 minutes blabbering her complaints about this innocuous dagger throw. See, the DM set it up so her character would hire hours for the first job of the game. She kept refusing to let me join, even after 3 separate apologies. Everyone was getting tense, so I finally broke character and made it clear that she was slowing the game down. She disagreed, but caved in to save face. This put a sour taste in everyone's mouth, and set the stage for how she would act for the entirety of the game. Throughout the session, she put her colors on full display. She insulted our DM relentlessly, criticized his choices, and complained at the slightest thing that didn't go her way, all while trying to impose a sort of pseudo-authority over the rest of us by giving us instructions. She would groan or fuss every time she rolled poorly, and she also had NPCs planted throughout the game, all of which conveniently supported the roleplay of her character, knowing her in some way, or having some sort of news for her. Another player actually had to point that out to me before claiming that she was likely co-DMing the very game she was playing in. Perhaps these were only Tiamat's suggestions made real by our somewhat passive DM, but all the same, it was clear that she had influence over the plot. Overall, session 1 was actually a lot of fun. However, every moment we had to deal with her was a hindrance. A few days after the session, I received a message from the DM telling me that Tiamat didn't appreciate the dagger throw and was still upset about it. I stood firm in my choices, and we eventually found common ground. I had no problem refraining from sounds like that towards other players, but thought this was one hell of a complaint to receive from Tiamat, who just days ago was arguing in favor of PvP. It was complete nonsense. I knew it. The players knew it, and I'm pretty sure the DM knew it. She was obviously upset that I wouldn't kowtow to her after interrupting her roleplay. However, that would make her look real bad, so she just focused on the dagger throw so she'd have a complaint that didn't make her look like an unlikable control freak. I hadn't asked the other players about this at the time, but it later came out that nobody was really fooled by this, and everyone generally found her behavior unnerving. So, the second session rolls around, and she's up to the same antics, nudging the DM to get her way, contesting decisions, and insulting him at every turn. Surprisingly, this time, our characters hardly interacted. Halfway through the game, we were rescuing villagers from cultists in the midst of a dragon attack. At that time, a girl that Lumen rescued on the back of his pony made it known that her friends were trapped in a temple that was being raided. The DM gave us 3 choices of places to defend. Tiamat and another player chose an unoccupied storehouse, while the other 2 of us chose the temple. It's worth noting at this point that Lumen put himself at risk twice in the session to trick the cultists into retreating, and to everyone's joy, it worked out both times. We saved several survivors in the temple, took them to safety, then endured more of Tiamat's planted roleplay NPCs, while Lumen juggled weapons for the children. Finally, the session came to a close. It's at this moment that Tiamat decided to address me. She spoke in character, saying something to the effect of, "You made mention of my ego last time. I hope you now see that you're wrong, and we can bury the hatchet." However, she said it in an even more smug and insincere voice than she normally uses. So Lumen replied, "We'll have to see. I'd like it if your tone changed first, though." You could hear the smoke billowing from Tiamat's nostrils. It started slowly at first. She claimed she was upset that she's trying to bury the hatchet, and I'm not going along with it. I explained that my character has been largely indifferent to her. He just doesn't like the way he's being spoken to. She claims she only speaks down to him because she's a noble, and she's upset about the dagger. Meanwhile, the other players jump to my defense, claiming that she speaks to everyone with the same smug voice. We hoped a little reality check would purify the well, but nothing worked. Tiamat snapped. She began hurling insults at me, screaming like a child, and throwing a tantrum. Several times she described Lumen as a little shit, claiming he only cared about gold and bragging rights. Mind you, Lumen acts cocky and jest, but this was the same character who went out of his way to save endangered civilians, gave a girl a pony ride in the midst of a dragon attack, and juggled blades for distraught children to lift their spirits. The players once again jumped to my defense. You may be asking where the DM was in all of this. Well, that's the real crux of this problem. It was clear to us by now that the relationship between the player and the DM was an abusive one, in which she leveraged her status as his friend against him to push him into making decisions against his better judgment. At this time, he was present, but staying out of it, because he didn't want to upset her by taking sides. That is, until she got fed up and gave him the ultimatum out loud that either she or I would be kicked from the game. You could almost hear every player's jaw drop at that moment. Finally, the DM made it a private conversation between the three of us. For the duration of this conversation, if you could call it that, the most vulgar things to leave my mouth were that she was rude, inconsiderate, and disruptive. I tried finding common ground and stressed that she needed to think about the way she acts affects the other players. Meanwhile, her choice comments including insightful phrases like this: "I'm his best friend, you don't know him, you're nothing, just dust to be swept away." I couldn't hold back a laugh at that hammy line, especially after I just watched this best friend spend a whole session insulting this man, then use her friendship as leverage to get her way. It was pathetic to watch and upsetting for everyone involved. I believe at one point she described him as a seeping wart, for having a poor connection. At times, it felt like she had these written down or something. I digress. The argument ensued, and Tiamat kept coming back to her ultimatum like a spoiled brat. Throughout this encounter, she'd also made it known that they had an agreement before this party was formed. She got to decide who joined, and anyone in the party who didn't work out with her would be kicked. Which is really just a dodgy way of saying she decides who gets to be in the game. Several times throughout this discussion, the DM would state to himself in English that he just wanted to play a game. Which makes me think this isn't the first time this has happened. About an hour later, in several pauses in which he had to mute the shouting out, he finally decided to put the issue on hold, and so he left. He and I would later have some private discussion about this, and while I was at it, I got the opinions of the other players. To no surprise, we were all on the same page, but it didn't really matter, because the DM told me that the whole reason he made this game was to play with her. If he kicked her, he'd save the game, but lose his reason for playing it. If he kicked me, the game would fall apart, as the other players had already made it pretty clear that they would leave if I were kicked or if she stayed. It was a lose-lose situation with him, and I realized that, so I decided to instead shift the conversation to his relationship with this woman. Apparently, they'd dated before. I can only imagine she'd been wearing him down for years, and in this case, it worked. Tiamat got her way. I was kicked from the game, and the other players are going to leave. Everybody's lost. So who's really at fault here? Yesterday, I would have told you it was Tiamat's fault. But with clear head, I think there's more than enough to be said about our DM. Personally, I think he's a great guy and an excellent DM, except when it comes to Tiamat. When you really get down to it, the reality is that Tiamat is an abuser, and the DM is an enabler. She's at fault for how she's acted, and he's at fault for knowingly putting a party at risk of her behavior, which based on his reaction is likely something he's experienced with other parties in the past. Tiamat is a horrible person, but the DM made a horrible choice. Two, in fact. As he's decided once again to bend his knee to this awful manipulative person who treats them like garbage. As for me, I'll be fine. I have a Sunday night Strahd game that kicks ass, and it won't be hard for me to pick up another game if I want to. If you're a DM, please do not let toxic players into your games, and if anyone is looking for an additional player, it would seem my schedule just opened up. By the way, I don't know if I said Tiamat correctly. Please let me know. She had no self-control at all. I felt bad for the DM for being wrapped in a manipulative and abusive relationship. It's very clear. She's very controlling and doesn't care about the DM's emotions or anything. But it can be really hard to exit those types of relationships. As we read, they did date, and probably makes it a little bit harder, but the DM was at fault also for allowing Tiamat to be acting the way she did, and Tiamat was at fault for being a literal child that didn't get her way. Wake up, it's the real world. Half of what you do won't be your way. A lot of people learn that as they grow up, unless they're raised and treated as if they'll get everything they want. But there wasn't a lot to say because a lot of it was said in the post. But please let me know what you think down in the comments. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time at Lace's Dungeon.